I never imagined that building, a few simple dams to protect my property, would turn into a full-blown nightmare. But that's exactly what happened. It all started when the forecast predicted an unusually heavy rainstorm. My land, a stretch of gently sloping fields and wooded areas, had always handled storms fairly well. But this one was different. I could see the water rising in the nearby creek, threatening to overflow and flood my property. My family's home, which had been in my family for generations, was suddenly at risk, and I knew I had to act fast. For 30 days, I worked tirelessly, measuring, digging, and stacking materials to create emergency dams. Each day was a grueling routine, waking up before sunrise, hauling sandbags, reinforcing the banks, and double-checking every barrier. Sweat ran down my face, dirt coated my clothes, and my hands were blistered, but I didn't care. Every moment I spent building those dams was a moment of defense against the impending disaster. I pictured the storm hitting and felt a strange mixture of fear and pride. This wasn't just about protecting land. It was about protecting everything my family had worked for over decades. But then Karen from the HOA entered the picture. I had always known her to be the rules enforcer of the neighborhood, but I underestimated how far she would go. One morning, as I inspected the dams after a long night of rain, I noticed something alarming. Tire tracks leading straight to one of the barriers. Before I could even process it, I saw Karen herself, clipboard in hand, marking the destruction. The dam I had poured weeks of labor into was being torn apart, piece by piece, as if all my effort meant nothing. I ran up shouting, but she merely waved me off, insisting she had authority to remove it. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The storm was still coming, and she was actively sabotaging my only line of defense. Panic set in immediately. I watched helplessly as water began to spill over the sections she had destroyed, rushing toward the lower fields and creeping dangerously close to my home. The sound of the water hitting the barriers was deafening. In that moment, I realized that my months of preparation could be wiped out in hours, all because of someone who didn't care about the consequences. My family's legacy, the land that had been ours for generations, was suddenly at the mercy of the storm and of HOA Karen. I knew I couldn't just stand by. I had to act, but what could one person do against the rising flood and someone so determined to stop me? The tension was unbearable, and I could feel the storm not just in the sky, but in the weight of what was about to happen next. By mid-afternoon, the rain had turned relentless. Sheets of water pounded the ground, and the creek that ran along the edge of my property was no longer a gentle stream. It had become a roaring river. I stood at the edge of what remained of my dams, heart racing, knowing that the destruction caused by HOA Karen had left my land vulnerable. Every drop of water seemed to mock me, reminding me of the barriers I had built so carefully, now broken and powerless against the rising flood. The first surge came suddenly. A section of my strongest dam collapsed with a deafening crash, sending a torrent of water rushing toward the lower fields. I tried to redirect it, throwing myself into the chaos. But it was like trying to stop the ocean with my bare hands. Mud and debris slammed against me, soaking my clothes, cutting my arms with branches, and forcing me to fight just to stay on my feet. Panic clawed at me, but I couldn't afford to succumb. I had to protect what was mine. And then Karen appeared again. I don't know how she got there so quickly, but there she was, clipboard in hand, glaring at me with a smug satisfaction that made my blood boil. "You can't stop it!" she shouted over the storm, almost cheering as the water spread across the fields. Her words were like a challenge, daring me to fight against her authority and the flood at the same time. I realized then that this wasn't just about water. It was a battle over control, over pride, over everything I had fought to protect. I ran toward the next vulnerable section of the dam, shoving sandbags into the path of the oncoming water. My hands were trembling, muscles screaming, but adrenaline carried me forward. Every minute felt like hours. Water surged around me, threatening to sweep me off my feet, yet I refused to give in. I thought of my family, of the history embedded in this land, of the generations who had worked tirelessly to keep it intact. I couldn't let it all be destroyed. Not today. Not by rain, and certainly not by HOA Karen. As I worked, I could see the flood creeping closer to the house, the smell of wet earth mixed with the metallic tang of rising water. I knew that if the last barrier failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. My mind raced through solutions, desperate for something, anything that could buy me time. Then, in a moment of clarity, I realized there was one option left, one desperate move that could turn the tide. But it came with immense risk. With the water rising faster than I could control, I knew I had to make a choice, and it had to be bold. There was no time to rebuild every broken dam. The floodwaters were relentless, spilling over the weakened sections, threatening my home and everything I had worked for. My hands were numb, my clothes soaked through, but my mind was focused. I needed a solution that could redirect the water, save the house, and maybe even teach HOA Karen a lesson she wouldn't forget. I spotted an old trench near the far edge of my property, a shallow, forgotten channel that I had dug years ago for irrigation. If I could widen it, reinforce it, and force the flood into this makeshift path, I might buy precious minutes for the house. It was risky. One misstep and the water could engulf everything faster than I could react. But hesitation wasn't an option. I grabbed the heaviest tools I had and began the grueling work, shoving mud and sandbags to shape the trench into a temporary floodgate. Every second mattered. Every movement counted. Meanwhile, HOA Karen was still there, standing near the edge of the destruction, her clipboard a symbol of authority that now seemed almost absurd against the raw power of nature. She shouted at me, calling me reckless, claiming I had no right to interfere with HOA property rules. But her words were meaningless. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about survival. The flood didn't care about bylaws or paperwork. The creek didn't negotiate with Karen, and neither would I. The water continued to surge, faster and higher than I anticipated. For a moment, I feared my plan would fail. The makeshift channel buckled under the pressure, and a wave of water splashed over my boots. Heart pounding, I doubled my efforts, reinforcing weak points and redirecting the flow with all my remaining strength. I could hear the pounding of rain and the roar of the creek, and yet I felt a strange sense of focus. Time slowed, and every movement became a calculation. Then slowly the tide began to turn. The channel held, forcing the worst of the water around the house rather than through it. I was drenched, exhausted, and bruised, but I could see that my home was no longer in immediate danger. I had done it. The flood had been diverted for now. Karen's expression shifted from smug superiority to shocked disbelief, her clipboard useless against the force of my determination. In that moment, it was clear who had truly fought for the land. When the rain finally began to ease, the extent of the flood became painfully clear. My fields were waterlogged, trees had toppled, and the smell of mud and debris lingered in the air. Yet, against all odds, my home stood firm. The emergency channel I had carved had held, diverting the brunt of the water and saving my family's property. Every soaked, aching muscle was a reminder of the struggle, but also of triumph. This was more than survival. It was a victory against both nature and the interference of HOA Karen. Karen was still on the property, her clipboard drooping uselessly at her side. She tried to argue, to assert some authority, but the sight of the diverted floodwaters spoke louder than any rules she could quote. For once, her control was meaningless. I confronted her, pointing out the damage that her destruction of the dams had caused and the lives it could have put at risk. She stumbled over excuses, her confident facade cracking under the weight of reality. I realized then that fighting back wasn't just about protecting the land. It was about showing that accountability matters. The cleanup was exhausting. For days, my family and I worked to repair the remaining damage, restore the fields, and reinforce the areas most affected by the flood. Neighbors came to check on us, some offering help, others expressing disbelief at the chaos caused by HOA Karen's actions. Every moment was a reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control when authority is misused, but it also reinforced a valuable lesson. Preparation, persistence, and courage can overcome even the most unexpected challenges. By the end of the week, the property had returned to a semblance of normalcy. The floodwaters receded, the emergency channel remained stable, and I had documented everything to prevent future interference. I knew that HOA Karen would continue to challenge me, but I felt empowered. The land had survived, and I had survived it, proving that determination and quick thinking could triumph over bureaucracy and reckless sabotage. My family's legacy remained intact, stronger for the trial it had endured. Standing on the porch, looking over the property, I felt a profound sense of relief and pride. The battle had been exhausting, terrifying, and at times nearly hopeless, but in the end, the land was safe, my family was safe, and I had faced both a natural disaster and human interference head-on. And while HOA Karen may have underestimated me, the lesson was clear. Some things, like family, home, and legacy, are worth fighting for, no matter the odds. The flood was over, but the story of determination, resilience, and standing up to those who try to control what's yours would never be forgotten. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me your thoughts in the comments. Your support keeps these stories going.